Last Sunday, India became the second team to play their 1,000th one-day international after Australia. By the time this podcast reaches you on a Saturday, they would have played their 1,002nd as well. They have sealed the series against West Indies when we are recording this on a Thursday. Sandip G, our cricket expert, penned down a wonderful long read for Express last week, breaking down the 1,000 ODIs 1 decade at a time. Now, he spoke with people from the ODI teams from that decade, and we will do that in an audio form as well. We'll try and go through the decades here, but our discussion today will have two parts. Later in the show, we'll try and make a sense of why 50-over cricket is an endangered format. Now, Sandeep, before we even get into the decades and all the players that you spoke to, what was your one major takeaway from having written this story? What was one thing that struck you?
I mean, how one-day cricket was central to India becoming the financial fulcrum of the cricketing world. Had India not won the 1983 World Cup, we might not have been sitting here talking cricket, maybe, because it had that kind of an impact. So, generally, the growth of Indian cricket and then how ODIs, when I started watching cricket, ODIs was everything. And then how it went down the drain, it's slightly painful too.
So let's start with the baby steps here. Sandeep, the first decade itself, the 70s, India picked up the format and there were a few teething troubles. And what was that decade like for India's ODI career?
That decade, India hardly played ODIs. ODIs were kind of still people were a bit skeptical about ODIs. They were not fully into it. The first series we played in 1974, it came after a very tumultuous test series when we lost, when we were bowled out by 42, when we were whitewashed 3-0. So that was the general setting also. Even Australia and England hardly played ODIs. ODIs was not even a second format. It was like people are not very serious about it. Just kind of a making the crowd happy kind of a thing it was. And then India played 13 ODIs, Australia played around 20-25 ODIs. In the 6 years, that was it. So generally in those days, when I spoke to Madan Lal about that, he said he had hardly ever watched an ODI match, let alone play one before the first ODI these guys played. And they were just like, okay, let's see how it works. And stakes were few. So there wasn't much pressure also when playing ODIs.
And how about the inaugural World Cup year? You write that Sunil Gavaskar's slow innings, 36 not out of 176 balls against England, stood out as a metaphor for the confused approach. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, ironically, Sunil Gavaskar only struck India's first 6. He struck there in his first ODI itself. He scored some 28 of 35 balls. It was not like, it just happened that 36 not out just happened. He didn't know what to do in that match. He tried to get out, he couldn't get out. It was that kind of an innings. Recently, he compared Dhoni innings to that actually. The 2015 World Cup, Dhoni had an innings. He sort of compared to that innings. But apart from that, when you look at the first scorecards of the first few games, actually India did batters it actually pretty well. There was Brijesh Patel who scored 81 runs of 78 balls, which was in that day and age and in those conditions. India were playing in Headingley, which generally tend to assist seam bowling a bit, especially back in those days. So it was not that bad. It was not like India had a horrendous start, but bowlers really struggled in that match. Bishan Singh Bedi has once said that, okay, he kept flighting the ball, kept looping the ball, and all turned out to be full tosses, which these guys just smacked around. In 12 overs, he considered around 60-70 runs too.
And one thing here which is not part of the story but which I really want to know is that what was the reason behind West Indies' immediate success, right? They were the dominating team in the test format, but suddenly the first 2 World Cups, they're winning that and they have a competent team which is going, firing on all cylinders. What was the secret there? What was the reason for their adaptability to ODIs?
They were preternaturally blessed with that kind of a players with ODI temperament, even in a test match scenario. They had somebody like Gordon Greenidge who could just unleash his cuts and pulls. They still had that phalanx of fast bowlers who could just go in there and hit the perfect length in ODIs too. They were ferocious in any format. If T20s were there back in the day, they would have dominated T20s too. That bowling unit, because they were very adaptable. They had lots of tricks. And they had pace, they had guile. So pace bowling was one of the big features. And of course, Vivian Richards was there. Vivian Richards used to bat in test matches like it were a ODI match. So it suited them. Clive Lloyd, another guy who scored 100 in that final. So they were that kind of guys who generally played even test matches like one-day games.
And then we move on to the heady 80s. And you write how this was India's leap straight to youth. From being a toddler who could barely walk around, they were now eligible for a vaccine shot. What was the reason behind such a spurt of growth? And who are the key characters from this decade? We know, and you have already touched upon it, the greatest time for India's ODIs happened during this decade, 1983 World Cup. But there were lot more achievements and a lot more upward growth to our trajectory during this decade, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had a raft of bowling all-rounders. Like, I mean, people who could bowl medium pace and bat a bit, people who could bat a bit and bowl medium pace, people who could bat really well and bowl off-spin, leg spin, left-arm spin, for example, Ravi Shastri, Srikanth. I mean, all these guys, it's a very utilitarian team. Maybe in a test match scenario, this team wouldn't have worked. And India didn't have a particularly great 80s when it came to test matches. But the team was perfect for ODIs. Like you had Srikanth, who was naturally aggressive and who was well ahead of his times in a way, in the way he put on runs early on in the innings. And there was Ravi Shastri, who bowled left-arm spin and who was a very good batsman too. And there was always guys like Mohindra Amarnath, now of course Kapil Dev, Roger Binny and Madan Lal. Some of them were actually bits and pieces kind of players, but they all stood up. That victory was more than a sum of its parts. And then naturally 1981-82, that time we won a ODI in West Indies, beating the really strong West Indies. That actually was a spur on, which according to Kapil Dev and people who featured in that World Cup win. And then once India won that World Cup, it was a steep upward climb. Then ODIs also became very popular. Like there was this World Series Championship became really attractive, and there were more televisions at home, and naturally ODIs became a major blockbuster.
Is this the decade that triggers the most nostalgia for you, Sandeep? Any great ODIs, or what stands out for you from the 80s ODIs?
I hardly watched any ODIs in the 80s. But all I remember was that, I mean, people, recollections, anecdotes, maybe second-hand nostalgia.
All those Richie Bennett and Tony Greig in the commentary booth that you talk about, and that whole now color is here. I know, and I made you seem like a 50-year-old when I said that it's triggered nostalgia. We're all of the same age here. But then again, there is that factor, no? I think you would agree that when you see those colored jerseys, even though we were not watching those ODIs live, but when we see those colored, we get pangs of nostalgia for whatever reason. Suddenly colored jerseys are there. And like you mentioned in the report as well, Bennett and Tony Greig, and the presentation itself became a lot more professional, right?
Absolutely. The commentary was top class. I mean, there were multiple camera angles. I mean, even now, when you just look back, like stumble on a match in 1895 or 80s, I mean, you feel you suddenly get goosebumps seeing that, even if you haven't actually watched that match, it was actually played on the television. Everything changed from there on. I mean, Richie Bennett, Tony Greig, I mean, they resonate pretty well even to this generation.
Now we move on to the era that I guess that rightly triggers all the nostalgia that we had. And you also penned it down very nicely, Sandeep, because you wrote about this. Calling it a one-man show would be harsh on the team that was there, but the 90s were ruled by this deity of sorts, this great cricketing superstar Sachin Tendulkar. But when we look beyond that, when we look beyond Desert Storm and everything, the achievements sort of dried up, right? It almost seemed like we were still finding our footing, and in different conditions we were struggling a little bit. So what do the 90s signify in terms of India for ODIs?
Underachievement. I mean, India was stuck still in the 80s. I mean, there were teams, also South Africa just burst into the scene, and they operated at a different level, especially in terms of the number of quality all-rounders they had and the fielding standards. The city of John D. Rhodes, how he changed world cricket with that. Just one run out, he changed how people perceived fielding. And then England had a very decent team. 92 World Cup, that the team that went to semi-finals was a pretty good team. I mean, they also struck a good combination. And then there was Australia, South Africa. Sri Lanka's emergence was a pretty irritating thing for a lot of Indian fans, played brilliantly well. So suddenly there was competition from everywhere. Zimbabwe was not a bad team. They beat India in that 99 group game in the World Cup. So amidst that competition, India lacked, especially in fielding and finding a good all-round. I mean, Robin Singh was only decent all-rounder we had back then. And suddenly all these bowling all-rounders dried up. Manoj Prabhakar had a few great years, 4 or 5 years, and then he, just after the 96 World Cup, after being mauled by Sanath Jayasuriya, that was it. So we could have struggled that way too. I mean, there was Tendulkar. I mean, there was always this hope on Tendulkar that he'll do something, he'll do this thing. He had done quite a few times, but generation was a very aspirational generation. They wanted to win big tournaments. They wanted to win series. Now we are getting mauled everywhere. You step out of India, even in Sri Lanka, India used to get fairly beaten. And overseas, we hardly used to win. Like a 92 series, India beat West Indies a couple of times and Australia once in that World Series Championship in 92. That kind of a generation when we were all felt very frustrated.
Yeah, but that's very true, and that's very rightly said, when you say that it was almost aspirational. It was like a reflection of the society itself, right? And even all of us growing up, we were aspiring for greater heights, and we somehow knew deep down inside that we are capable of reaching those heights. And hence the frustration that you're talking about. And I guess the self-loathing as well, that I don't know why it's not clicking for us, why it's not happening. But Sandeep, talk us through the Desert Storm. At least you watched that live, no? Or matlab, wo to dekha hai na tumne.
Yeah. I watched it live.
What was the memory? What was the sentiment like? And before you even start, I'll just say ki, like you said, Sachin Tendulkar was the man. And listeners, that is not an overstatement or an overreaction and an exaggeration when we say, yaar, ki Sachin out ho gaya, chalo band kar dete hain. That used to happen in my household. Like when Sachin will get dismissed, we'll begrudgingly we'll switch off the TV and we'll just say, ki, theek hai, kal newspaper mein we'll check out the scorecard and whatnot. But yeah, go ahead, Sandeep.
I knew friends who used to go to the temple and pray for Tendulkar. Before Desert Storm, I like Tendulkar, but I was not a Tendulkar fan kind of a thing. Like
typical.
Always a little non-contour in that way. I mean, my favorite was always Mohammad Azharuddin, Vinod Kambli, even Praveen Ambre. So that innings made me a Tendulkar fan. Like, I mean, I absolutely fell in love with him. That was the precise moment that the first knock against Australia, where we had to qualify. That was the match, okay. When I was swooned by this guy. Still, I watched it with my friends at my home and still very emotional. I can almost remember every ball what happened. Like when Australia was batting as well as India was batting. I mean, the whole nervousness. 10 years later, if I watch this match, I'll get a heart attack. That kind of a match. I mean, both those games. And then the irony was that, I mean, VVS Lakshman used to hang around, and then in next 3 years, he plays one of the greatest innings you ever watch in a test match. So we used to abuse him. Hey, this guy is not hitting, this guy is not taking singles, this guy is getting stuck. And then it was an emotional roller coaster. Like, even now, when you think of that, the kind of emotions that seize you, it's unbelievable.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's a nice segue into the noughties, the 2000s, where we sort of found our identity and we sort of found that great leader that we were yearning for in Saurav Ganguly. And even VVS Lakshman, when you talk about that great 281, he went just brand roughshod in Australia, even in the ODIs, right?
Yeah, 300s.
That's one thing that is often ignored. And this was a decade where we sort of came into our own. We had this new bunch of cricketers. Of course, that emotional resonance was still there in the form of Sachin Tendulkar. He was still going strong. But what exactly happened there, and what was the nucleus of this great 2000s Indian team?
There were a lot of fresh youngsters like Mohammad Kaif, Yuvraj Singh, Zahir Khan, of course. So these guys came and then just lifted the standards. Like suddenly, I mean, we have more than one match winner. I mean, we always had Rahul Dravid and Saurav Ganguly and all. But then we were possibly looking at a team where 6 or 7 of the guys can win a match. And they started winning. The 2002 NatWest Trophy obviously seized all our imagination. It was kind of like we got that belief from that match. It was the equivalent of that Calcutta test in ODIs. It gave us a kind of a belief that, okay, it was kind of like we broken a glass ceiling. We come out of glass ceiling. Okay, now there's no limits kind of a thing it was. That was why even when Australia racked up that monstrous score in the 2003 World Cup, everybody was hopeful that India will chase it down. Because India had actually that ammunition to chase it down. If it were not a final, if it was something like a group game, maybe India would have.
Yeah, I know you say everybody, but again, me and my household, when as soon as Sachin tried to hook that Glenn McGrath delivery and he holed out, yeah, we lost most of our hopes. But those were two aberrations, right? The matches against Australia, we lost in the group stages and the final itself. But throughout that tournament, the run and everybody contributing, right? Ashish Nehra springing out of nowhere, taking 6. And
yeah, absolutely. Ashish Nehra was a beautiful spell.
Yeah, great innings. Sachin himself delivering at the biggest stage. Saurav Ganguly scoring hundreds. So, Sandeep, what were you doing during that NatWest final? And for our listeners, I'm sure majority of you remember the match and the score, but India were chasing 327 and they had been given a good start. If I remember correctly, Sandeep, Sehwag and Ganguly, they were combined for a good start.
Yeah. Sehwag and Ganguly reserve. Yeah.
But then a collapse and then a great rescue. So take us through your eyes and your memories.
Once I said 327, I was like, okay, this is gone. Like, I mean, this match is beyond India kind of a thing. And then we were like, okay, I always used to watch those games back in the day with my friends, either at somebody's house, either at my house, or it was like, generally it used to be my house because, I was an only child and mother was there. So, I mean, there was a lot of space. I mean, mother was tolerant to noise and music. She was fine. So they used to flock in my house. So after that, like once 327 and then, okay, we were like, we'll watch for 5 hours. Let's see what these guys can do. Then 10 hours it became. Then 15 hours became. That by 20 hours when Tendulkar was out, it was like, okay, it's over. And then those days there used to be 2 channels, like ESPN and Star Sports. So it was, I think, in Star Sports, and we switched to ESPN for some football match, some random football match we were watching. And then by the time most of them had left, when I switched back the television, it was around about 35 hours and these guys were batting really well. Then I thought, okay, let's watch it. When that moment came, I felt so lonely because there was nobody around. There was nobody to high five. There was nobody to express my ecstasy.
Then you took off your t-shirt and started waving it over your head, much like Saurav Ganguly.
No. That I didn't do.
But even that bit, yeah, as ridiculed, as mocked it is, for the right reason also. I don't know how many tabijes and necklaces and chains and whatnot he was wearing. But even that moment, that sort of signified that streak of defiance, right, that defined India during this decade.
Yeah. Symbolic. It could actually stand as a metaphor of India in that era. Like, I mean, it's when India, not just content copying the blows, but India were also capable of giving those blows back, delivering a knockout punch. And that's as a metaphor of Indian cricket in that 2000s. And then it went on to the next decade also.
Yeah.
Virat Kohli must have been inspired by that too.
Absolutely. I know what it says about him if he was inspired by a shirtless Saurav Ganguly doing the waving t-shirt thing, but
No.
Yeah, at least the sentiment was there. Right, I understand. And yeah, we move on to the next decade. Of course, there was the 2007 debacle, which again brought out the ugly side of Indian cricket fans, in my opinion. There were a lot of things going wrong on the field as well, but I remember all those effigies being burnt and houses being stoned for no reason. And suddenly, quickly, they were pacified by India's great 2007 T20 World Cup win by MS Dhoni and company. But we move on to the 2010s, and the greatest peak yet, Sandeep, you would say 2011 World Cup, this great team, all characters, and again, much like, I guess that's key to any successful World Cup campaign, but everybody delivered, and even though there were a couple of standouts, it was almost like this was a team in its entirety that was beating the world.
Absolutely. When you look at that, all 15 players actually contributed in one way or the other. From Virendra Sehwag to even Srishant had a couple of good games. So it was that kind of a match when India had to win this World Cup at home. Probably Tendulkar's last. I can't imagine Tendulkar hanging on to 2015. And in 2015, half of them wouldn't have been there or half of them would have been past their prime. The number of careers that precipitated soon after that. I mean, Yuvraj Singh was never the same guy. Harbhajan Singh lost his mojo. Virendra Sehwag retired in another couple of years. And Tendulkar also lost much of his game after that. So Zahir Khan also, like his career also flatlined after that. So it was kind of a peak for not only Indian cricket 10, 20 years, but for a lot of cricketers, for a generation of cricketers.
It was almost like that was the perfect moment, right? All the stars had aligned, and if you had missed that one final, it was largely a smooth ride, but there were still quite a few stumbles and quite a few heart attacks and scares that were given to us. And if you had lost that match, this Indian team, that would have been frustrating. Like you said, a lot of these players would have finished their careers with broken hearts and broken dreams. But Sandeep, again, like I've been asking you, where were you on that night? And take us through your emotional rollercoaster of sorts. Were you staunch in your belief? Did you never lose faith? Or were you also scared during that final?
No. I was not scared of that final. I mean, I didn't cover the final, but I was there. I was at home. Like, I just covered that semi-final in Mohali, so I just came home. I was not on duty that day, so I was just aram se chilling at home, relaxing, watching the match, enjoying the match. I mean, I was not as emotional as I was maybe when I was watching the 2003 World Cup or even 2007. I was not very emotional. I mean, I was kind of okay, let's see how it goes on kind of a thing it was.
So I guess, that is where the difference lies, because you had started reporting and you had become this great cynic, this skeptical, this hatred of Indian success that fueled you, I guess, as a journalist. But whereas I was in college, and believe it or not, anybody who can see me now won't believe it, but I was in the gym watching the Indian reply, and when Sehwag and Tendulkar, they fell early, I was a bit scared, but then this guy Virat Kohli walked in, and Gautam Gambhir played that knock, Yuvraj and Dhoni and everybody, they took us home. So just the fact that I'm saying they took us home shows you that I wasn't a working journalist back then. But Sandeep, we move on to 2015 and then 2019, the twin heartbreaks in semi-finals for Indian cricket fans. And then we move on to the larger discussion as well, which I wanted to ask you why the one-day cricket is an endangered format right now, because we have been gushing over it for about half an hour, recounting all our great highs, all our great lows, all the great characters that we had. But suddenly, one-day cricket is the one that is the most in danger, it seems, compared to either tests or T20s. What are some of the factors that you feel behind it?
Certainly, the mushrooming of T20 leagues has a big role to play because, like, the calendar is almost full. Like, you have BBL, you have IPL, you have all these, you have PSL. So, you have that kind of leagues, and then there is Test cricket too. So, ODIs have become this sort of in-between kind of a format where it doesn't give as much as thrill as ODIs, nor does it give as much as drama as Test matches. So, it's got somewhere between it. And then there's not just bilateral series after the end of a Test series doesn't make any sense. You need triangular tournaments and this quadrangular series to actually revive ODI cricket. Two teams, and these days, like most of the big names, like at the end of a Test series, almost all the ODIs are scheduled at the end of a Test series. So generally, a lot of players take rest, a lot of players tend to skip it, and so basically you end up playing with the second string, and there's no context. Now they've started this World Cricket League, wherein like Test Championship, like on points, you get points for winning series and all those stuff. But even that doesn't infuse that kind of a context for ODIs unless there's a World Cup nearing. There's no interest in ODIs per se. There's still crowd and all. Whenever there's an ODI match, especially in the subcontinent, people flock. That's it. Just forget about it after that.
Sandeep, I guess one hypothesis could be that because India isn't winning World Cups, the format is under danger because we have great lineups in England, in Australia, but this is bigger than India, right? I know we've talked about how India became the financial fulcrum, and India's evolution throughout these decades coincided with ODI's evolution as well. But now, I guess the problem is with the format itself, and not because it's not like if India won the 2023 World Cup, suddenly everything is hunky-dory and everything is back to normal, everybody is loving ODIs again, or is that a possibility still?
If India needs to win that World Cup, at least to give ODIs just a little bit of a prop-up. But look at the larger picture. It still needs a bit of a polishing in some way or that. I don't know what exactly cricket can do to restore this format. Maybe triangular series, World Series championships, some kind of things like that. There need to be some sort of pep to this tournament. To this ODIs. It's inconsequential ODIs, bilateral series happening here and there. For example, this West Indies series, the matches were actually pretty good. But that's it. And another thing must be also that there are few very competent sides. When you look at it, like Sri Lanka has gone down the drain. West Indies is not long the force. South Africa is also not a great side. Not what it used to be in the 90s or the aughts. Just Australia, England and India. That's it. That is also a bit of a concern. For ODIs to thrive, you need at least 6, 7, 8 teams to be pretty good.
Right. Personally, though, I think I've said this on the podcast before as well. ODIs, the format itself will always remain close to my heart because there is tests for the purists, right? There's always that. And there's T20s for everybody who just wants that short burst. And nothing wrong with that. T20s are a very great, very entertaining format on its own. But ODI is somewhere, I don't know. And I like them because of the middle overs, Sandeep. I know they're the power plays and everybody goes gung-ho and the death overs. But middle overs, when things are being taken to the conclusion and you don't realize when the chokehold is being applied, when batsmen are farming strike and they're scoring runs and consolidating. I think that's the best bit about ODI cricket. But at this point, I'll bring in Shashank Bhargava, our producer, very quickly. Shashank, nobody escaped the ODI's craze, especially the decade that we are talking about, 90s, even though we know you're 17 years old. But still, what has been your connection with India and ODIs? Any memories of watching the match in its entirety or anything?
Yeah, I'm the wrong person to ask this question because as someone who's not interested in cricket, my memories of ODI, ODIs are just waiting for the match to get over so I can watch something else on TV, right? Even at home, and I was in a boarding school and there was TV bus weekend pe dekhne ko milta hai, and there's one TV for 50 people. And if there's an ODI happening on the weekend, you're like, now that entire day is gone. Pura din ka wo TV book ho gaya. There's no consideration for non-cricket fans or non-sports fans. So मेरा ODIs के साथ ये association है. With at least T20 is okay, खत्म होने वाला है. कुछ और देखने की possibility है.
Jesus, I don't know why I bring you in for your perspective when all you do is bring it all crashing down. Arsh se farsh tak. Either we are spewing rhetoric about the great ODI format and how to save it, and suddenly you're like, बस खत्म हो जाए जल्दी, मुझे देखना ही नहीं है. So yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for that, Shashank. No great ODI memory, no great ODI innings that springs to mind.
No, yeah. In fact, one thing I would say about ODIs is that was one thing my father, sister and I could watch together. So that was something we could do. And, because there are not many things that interest that my father and I share. So I have those memories, but they have absolutely nothing to do with cricket. They have everything to do what was happening around it.
अरे but those are the great cricketing memories यार. हमारी भी वही है. We don't, at least I don't remember ball by ball or an innings by innings, but I don't know, that general, that bonhomie or familial time थोड़ा सा जब होता था when me and my father and my mother and everybody in the household could just sit together and watch a cricket match. I guess that's why I like ODIs still, because वो थोड़ा सा family time जो साथ में मिलता था कि everybody's attention is towards the TV. On that note, let's wrap it up for today. Game Time comes out every Saturday. Stay tuned to the Express Sports podcast. Do share your feedback. Do share your rating. Do give a thumbs up on whichever podcast app that you use. It helps us out. But more importantly, stay safe. Adios.
You were listening to Express Sports by the Indian Express. This week's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.